Alright all, like the title suggests, in today's video we have an unboxing and overview. We're looking at the Asrock B450m Pro4 motherboard. I don't like calling these things reviews because to have an actual review you need to have time with the product. So this is just kind of an unboxing and overview of it. We're going to run down through the specs, see what it does support and what it don't support. And I'm going to be taking it out of the box and show you what all comes with this motherboard. Let me flip you over here at Newegg and we'll run down through these specs for you. Alright guys, here we are on Newegg. We have the Asrock B450m Pro4 motherboard. The day of this filming is going for about $83. Down here under the specs, it is an Asrock motherboard. It is the B450m Pro4 motherboard. That's the model. CPU, it is an AM4 socket. It supports AM4 socket Ryzen 2000, 3000, and 5000 series desktop processors. The chipset is the AMD Promontory B450 motherboard. That is the chipset. 288 pins, which is DDR4 memory. The memory standards, this does depend on what CPU you have in it. If you have the Mastice, it supports DDR4 3200, 2933, 2667, 2400, 2133 ECC and non-ECC unbuffered memory. If you have the Pinnacle Ridge, it supports up to 3200 plus OC, 2933 OC, 2667, 2400, 2133 ECC and non-ECC non-buffered memory. If you have the Picasso CPU, it does support 2933, 2667, 2400, 2133 non-ECC non-buffered memory. If you have the Summit Ridge CPU, it supports DDR4 3200 plus OC, 2933 OC, 2667, 2400, 2133 ECC and non-ECC non-buffered memory. If you have the Raven Ridge CPU, it supports up to 3200 plus OC, 2933, 2667, 2400, 2133 non-ECC non-buffered memory. Verizon series CPUs, Picasso and Raven Ridge ECC is only supported with the Pro CPUs. It does support up to 128 gigs of DDR4. And down here it gives you a little note. If you're running a 32-bit Windows operating system, it only supports up to 4 gigs. That's why everybody should be running a 64-bit operating system. That way it sees more than 4 gigs and you can use more than 4 gigs of RAM. It does run dual channel. Alright guys, and on the expansion slots on this motherboard for the 16 by times 16 slots, you have 2 slots. One is an Express 3.0 times 16. The other one is Express times 2 times 16. And just like the RAM, this does depend on which CPU you're running. If you're running the Mastice, the Summit Ridge, or the Pinnacle Ridge, it's the PCI Express 3x0 times 16 slot runs PCI Express 2 times 16 mode. If it's the Picasso or the Raven Ridge, it's running PCI Express 2 times 8 mode. If you're running the Athlon series CPU, it is running the PCI Express times 4 mode. It does support NVMe SSDs as the boot disks. The second PCI times 16 slot is Express times 2. If you have the Mastice, the Summit Ridge, or the Pinnacle Ridge, it is a PCI Express 3x4 mode. If you run the Picasso or the Raven Ridge, it is PCI Express 3x4 mode. If you run an Athlon processor, it does run a PCI Express 3x4 mode. And it does also have an Express 2.0 times 1 slot. For the storage device on it, you do have 4 SATA 3 6 gigabit connectors. It does support RAID, NCQ, and AHCI and hot plug. The M.2_2 and the SATA 3 shows lanes. If either one of them is in use, the other one will be disabled. The M.2, you have one Ultra M.2 socket. M.2_1 supports M-key type 2242, 2260, 2280, M.2 PCI Express mode up to Gen 3 times 4, 32 gigabits with Mastiff, Picasso, Summit Ridge, Raven Ridge, and Pinnacle Ridge. or Gen 3 times 2, 16 gigabytes with the Athlon series for APUs. The other M.2 is the M.2_2 supports M-key type 2230, 2240, 2260, 2280, M.2 SATA 3, 6 gigabit per second modulars. They support NVMe SSD as a boot disk. Supports Asrock U.2 kit. Basically, the one M.2 is a ×3×4, Gen 3 ×4, and the second one only supports the SATA 3 SSDs. If you want to run RAID on this motherboard, it does support 0, 1, and 10. Onboard video chips, which this does depend on your CPU. You do have to have an APU series to be able to run them. You do have a D-sub, a DVI-D, and an HDMI, which them's pretty common resolutions depending on which one you're using there. If you want to read down through what ports support what kind of resolutions, if you're running an APU. The max shared memory is 16 gigabit, but you have to have 32 gigs of system memory installed to be able to get up to 62 gigs for your APUs. Onboard audio, you have the Real-Link ALC892. Audio channel, 7.1 channel. To configure 7.1 channel HD audio, it is required to use the HD front port audio modular and enable the multi-channel audio feature through the audio drivers. Onboard LAN, it does run the Real-Link RTL811H. Max LAN speed is 1000 megabits, which is 1 gigabit. Real panel ports, the back I/O. You have one PS2 mouse and keyboard port. You have one D-sub. You have one DVI-D port. You have one HDMI port. Which, like I mentioned, to run them 3 ports right there, you have to have the APU. You do have 2 USB 2 ports. You do have one USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type A port. You have USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C port. You have 4 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports. You have one RJ45 LAN port. And you have an HD audio jack line in front speaker microphone. Internal connectors, onboard USB. This does have 2 USB 2 headers, and it does have one USB 3.1 Gen 1 header. Other connectors on the motherboard, you do have the COM port header, you do have a TPM header, you do have the chassis intrusion header, you have a power LED and speaker header, you have one RGB LED header, you have one addressable LED header, you have one AMD fan LED header, you have one CPU fan connector, which is a 4-pin, you have one CPU water pump fan connector, which is a 4-pin, smart fan speed control, you have 3 chassis fan, water pump, and fan connectors, 4-pin, smart fan speed control, you have one front audio connector. Okay, it is a micro ATX motherboard. It does have RGB and ARGB headers on it. Dimensions in width and length is 9.6 by 9.6. Power pins, it's got one 24-pin connector, and it has one 8-pin 12-volt connector for your CPU connector. And this motherboard was first available on July the 19th of 2018. Alright guys, that pretty well wraps it up for what this motherboard will offer you. And now I'll be taking it out of the box to show you what all comes in the box and showing you some of the major ports that you'll need on the motherboard at least. And then I'll be back with my conclusion to the video. Alright guys, now since we went down through the specs of it, we're going to be taking it out of the box here and seeing what all comes in this thing. And I'm going to show you some of the features on this one. Like I said, this is the Asrock B450m Pro4 motherboard. It is for your AMD Ryzen. You can tell down here that it is 2000 series ready, and they put a sticker on here that says it's also 3000 series ready, so you won't have to update the BIOS to get that 3000 series processor working in this motherboard. Let's take it out of the box here and see what all comes with it. I'm going to pull open the flap here and see what comes on top. Okay, it looks like this is your M.2 screws for your M.2s on it. There's 2 of them. Put them to the side. Here's a little storage guide. Tells you about your RAMs and which RAM sticks to use first for your dual channel. Of course, you got your I/O shield. This is a budget motherboard after all, so you do have just a plain little pressed out metal back shield for it. What we got here? We have two SATA cables, one right angle and one straight. So you got two SATA cables with it. You got your owner's manual here, and your coffee mug holder there, or it's actually a DVD for your drivers, which nobody ever uses. We'll get them off the line once we get the system built. Alright, pull up the cardboard flap here. There's your motherboard in the anti-static bag, and that looks to be it. The box is empty. Alright guys, here we are with it inside the anti-static bag. I'm going to pull it out here. Reach in here and grab a hold of it, pull it out. There we go. Alright, it's a pretty common little layout for a micro ATX motherboard here. You have your 4 RAM slots right here. You have your 24-pin connector for your motherboard power. There's your USB 3. Down here is your 4 SATA ports, which is all right angled, which is pretty nice. Down here we have your front panel connectors. You have your CMOS clear jumper right here. You have 2 chassis fan connectors right here. Here's your 2 USB 2 connectors for your internal USB connected devices. Over here is your RGB header. There's your ARGB header. There's your front audio, if you want to hook up front audio to it. You have 2 of the 16 slots here, long 16 slots. You have your by 1 slot right there. M.2 for there, and M.2 up here. There's your 3rd chassis fan connector. There's your CPU socket where your AM4 socket will go into. And there's your 2 brackets for your cooling solution if you need them. Your VRMs looks like they do have a little bit of passive cooling on them. So it may not be too bad for overclocking, but it is a budget motherboard, so take that with a grain of salt. And up here your CPU fan header, and optional CPU fan header for like your water pumps or whatnot if you want to do some water cooling or put an AIO on this. It does have an 8-pin supplemental power for your CPU, which tells me that it is at least overclockable compatible. You can overclock with this motherboard. Okay, I'm going to flip it up here and we'll look at the back panel of it here. The back I/O of it. It is a pretty budget motherboard, so you do only have 3 audio ports here. You have your RJ45 for your internet. Looks like you have 5 USB 3 ports and a USB-C port. If you're going to be running an APU in the system, you got an HDMI, a VGA, and a DVI-D port. There's your combination old school mouse and keyboard port, and 2 more USB 2s. Them is usually used for your keyboard and mouse. That's pretty well it for the back panel of it. But that's pretty well what the board offers you and what comes in the box. Let me get reset up here and I'll come up with a conclusion to the video for you. Alright, we went down through the specs of what this motherboard offers you. I took it out of the box, showed you what all comes with it. Kind of pinpointed some of the main connectors that most people need on a motherboard. It does have a RGB and ARGB header on it, which is nice. It does come with 3 fan connectors for your chassis fans, plus your CPU fan header, plus a water pump header or a CPU optional header for your water pumps if you want to do an all-in-one or you want to do a custom loop with this motherboard. It is a B450 chipset, which is overclockable, but with the VRMs, I wouldn't expect too much out of them processors. It is nice that it does do all the way up to the 5000 series CPUs, which will probably need a upgraded BIOS update on that. But I think it'd be I think it's a pretty good little stable motherboard so far from what I've seen of it for a budget gaming PC build. If you like this kind of content, make sure you get out and give me a like. If not, give me a dislike. There's a comment section below. I'll go through them every weekend on my live stream here Saturday morning, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in the U.S. If you really like this kind of content, make sure you hit that sub button, that notification bell, where you're notified next time I go live or put another video here on YouTube. If you're interested, I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. I don't kill your inbox, but I do put up photos of new stuff I have coming in. Kind of give you an idea of what's coming up on the channel. If there's any kind of news on my live stream, if I got canceled or change the time or change the date of it, that's where you also get that information. With all that being said, you all have a good day, and I'll see you in the next video or live stream.